The first time Jane told me about the smell, I thought she was crazy. She had called me late, past midnight, whispering into the phone like someone might hear. Her voice was tight, shaking. She said she was at her cabin, alone, and something was outside. I asked her what it was. She didn't say a person or an animal. She didn't even say a thing. She just said, "It smells like it did that night." And I knew exactly what she meant. Back then, it was supposed to be a quick trip. Just Jane, me, and a couple of friends hiking near Black Hollow Forest. We'd heard the stories, but we laughed them off. Every small town has legends, right? Things that hunt in the dark. Things that come back for you if you escape. But the smell was real. It came out of nowhere, rolling over us in thick, humid waves, wet earth and decayed leaves, clotted with something worse, like rotten meat mixed with a slightly sweet tinge. It was so strong I gagged. Jane grabbed my arm, nails biting into my skin. Her face had gone white. Then we heard the first scream. We ran. I don't know how long or how far, just that we didn't stop until the sounds faded. When we finally collapsed, gasping, Jane whispered something I'll never forget. "It doesn't need to see you. It smells you." We never found the others. That was 6 years ago. Jane doesn't talk about that night. She moved out here, way off the grid, in this little cabin on the edge of the woods, far from town, far from people, far from anything that smells like death. So when she called me tonight, whispering that the scent was back, I didn't ask if she was sure. I just grabbed my keys and started driving. Jane's call cut out, but I didn't need to hear more. I was already breaking every speed limit, flying down the back roads toward her cabin. The last thing she had whispered, "It's inside." I kept my foot on the gas, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. That smell, I could remember it like it had never left me. Thick, rotting foliage, damp earth, something sickly sweet, swollen with decay. It had come back for her. I just prayed I wasn't too late. Jane's cabin sat on the edge of the forest, deep enough into nowhere that there wasn't another house for miles. I skidded onto the dirt driveway, gravel spitting under the tires. The porch light flickered, pulsing weakly. I killed the engine, shoved the door open, and froze. The smell hit me instantly. It was so strong my stomach clenched. The air was thick with it, pressing against my skin like damp rotting hands. I covered my nose with my sleeve, swallowing against the nausea. The windows of the cabin were dark, the curtains drawn. Jane's truck sat untouched in the driveway, but the front door was open. Not wide, just a crack, just enough for something to slip inside. I reached for the handle of my car door and stopped. The woods behind me were dead silent. Not even the wind stirred the trees. No insects, no night birds. Like everything had already decided this place was lost. A breath of cold air rolled across the back of my neck. And then I smelled it again. Stronger, closer. I stepped onto the porch, forcing my legs to keep moving, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The wood creaked under my boots. The front door swung open at my touch. Inside, the air was thick, heavy. The only sound was the faint tick, tick, tick of Jane's kitchen clock. I stepped in slowly. The house was dim, shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. The kitchen was to my left, the hallway to the bedrooms ahead. And then, a sound. A slow, groaning creak, wood shifting under weight. I turned my head toward the hallway just as something moved. Not fast, not a sudden lunge, just a shape sliding out of view, deeper into the house. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I reached for my phone, but my hands were slick with sweat. My fingers fumbled against the screen. No signal. I swallowed hard. Jane? My voice barely sounded like mine. Silence. Then, a soft click from the pantry. I crossed the kitchen, stepping carefully. The pantry door was closed, but something about it felt wrong. I reached out, fingers brushing the handle. Before I could turn it, something shifted behind the door. A slow, deliberate movement. A breath, not mine. I wrenched the door open. Jane was there, curled into the back corner, eyes wide, hands pressed over her mouth. She didn't react at first, just stared past me, trembling. Then, finally, a whisper. It knows you're here. I barely had time to process that before something exhaled right behind me. Jane's whisper barely left her lips. It knows you're here. The words hadn't even registered when I felt it. A slow, rattling exhale against the back of my neck. The smell hit me at full force. Hot, putrid breath, thick with decay. My stomach lurched. The air behind me shifted, something tall looming in the dim light. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body refused to move. Jane's fingers dug into my arm, her eyes locked on something over my shoulder. Her lips parted like she wanted to scream, but nothing came out. The floor creaked. I finally forced myself to move. My hand shot out, grabbing Jane's wrist as I yanked her forward. The moment we moved, the thing behind us did too. A wet, shambling sound. We burst into the kitchen, Jane stumbling behind me. I shoved the pantry door shut, like that would do anything, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. And I saw it. Jesus Christ. It stood at the far end of the kitchen, just beyond the hallway. The dim light barely touched it, but I could see its shape, long and thin. It just looked wrong. It was hunched, its shoulders brushing the ceiling, its head cocked to one side. Its skin was mottled and wet-looking, like something that had been buried and dug up too late. But its face, if you could call it that, was worse. I don't know if it had eyes. I don't think it needed them. Its head twitched, nostrils flaring, sniffing. The smell in the cabin was unbearable now, thick with wet rot, mold, and something meaty and sour. Jane's nails dug into my arm. She was shaking so badly I thought her legs might give out. Her lips moved, barely a sound coming out. It's smelling for us. The thing exhaled again. A deep, wet sound, like air pushing through something broken. It took a step forward. Jane ripped me sideways. We hit the back door hard, fumbling with the lock. Behind us, I heard the thing dragging itself closer, its breath wheezing in the silence. Jane finally got the door open, and we stumbled out into the freezing night. The second we left the cabin, I realized something horrible. The smell was outside too. Jane must have realized it at the same time, because she whimpered, her breath hitching. "It's not alone," she choked. The forest around the cabin was wrong, dark and swollen with that awful putrid stench. The trees stood still, the air thick and heavy. I could feel it pressing against my skin, suffocating. And then, a rustling sound. Not from behind us, from the trees, all around us. Jane grabbed my arm. "We have to..." Her sentence interrupted by a snapping branch. Something moved in the tree line. And then, from the dark, a second breath, somewhere in the trees. Jane's grip on my arm tightened, her fingers ice cold. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. Then, a third breath, and a fourth. All around us. They weren't alone. The air felt thick and wrong. The trees stood like skeletal figures, black against the night sky. The wind had died completely. The world held its breath. I heard something shift in the undergrowth, a wet, slithering sound. A branch cracked to our left. Jane exhaled, barely a sound. It's a trap. Her voice was so small, so broken, I barely recognized it. She had known. She had known it would come back. I pulled her close, my voice barely above a whisper. Jane, what did you do? Her whole body shuddered. I didn't know, she rasped. I didn't know I brought it with me. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? She squeezed her eyes shut. That night, when we ran, I thought I got away clean. I thought it let me go. The things in the forest were moving closer. Their stench swirled around us. Wet rot, rancid earth, the sickly sweet stench of decay. It was everywhere. Jane took a shaking breath, but when I got home that night, I smelled it. A lump formed in my throat. She trembled against me. It faded after a few weeks. I thought, maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just in my head. Her voice broke, but I think it marked me. I felt my pulse slam against my ribs. She swallowed, and I think it waited for me to be alone. A slow dragging sound came from the trees. I turned my head just slightly, just enough to see a shape pulling itself from the shadows. I felt something cold and slick slide down my spine, because I finally understood. The night Jane escaped, she wasn't the prey. She was the bait. I grabbed Jane's wrist. Run! She didn't hesitate. We bolted. The ground wasn't solid anymore. It felt soft, too soft, like the earth itself had begun to rot beneath our feet. Each step sent up the smell of damp, sickly sweet decay. Something moved fast behind us. Too fast. I risked a glance back, and immediately wished I hadn't. They were everywhere, emerging from the trees, long-limbed and wrong. Their heads twitched, sniffing the air, their bodies swaying like broken marionettes. One of them let out a noise, a deep, gurgling cackle, and then one reached for Jane. I yanked her forward just as a clawed hand snapped shut where she had been. Jane screamed. Ahead, I saw the faint glow of headlights. My truck. If we could just make it. Something grabbed my ankle, and I hit the ground hard. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Jane still running, and something crawling toward me. My face hit the dirt. The smell was inside me now, thick and suffocating, putrid, wet decay seeping into my lungs. Something was wrapped around my ankle, cold, clawed, unyielding. I kicked hard, but the grip tightened, dragging me backward. The ground beneath me felt soft, spongy, like I wasn't lying on dirt anymore but something rotting. My nails clawed at the earth, but it crumbled in my hands. Ahead of me, Jane was still running. She hadn't noticed I was down. Jane! Something yanked me hard. I flipped onto my back. It was there. It loomed over me, its unnaturally long limbs folding as it crouched low. It had no eyes, no lips, just dark, wet slits where a nose should be. Its entire body twitched, convulsing, like it was barely holding itself together. The stench pouring off of it was unbearable. And then it did the worst thing of all. It breathed in. A long, deep inhale that sent a ripple through its body. Its nostrils flared, pulling in every last trace of my scent, savoring it. And I finally understood. The smell, the foul, rancid rot that had haunted us for years. It wasn't just them. It was the ones they had taken. It was what we became. My breath came in short, painful increments. My whole body felt weak, wrong. I could feel it, something curling in my gut, in my lungs. Jane had been right. It had marked her. And now it was marking me. This wasn't just a hunt. This was a process. The smell wasn't just rot. It was people. People who had been caught. People who had been turned. People like me. I looked down at my hands and saw the dark, oily residue soaking into my skin. The same residue Jane had on her all those years ago. Oh my God. There was a flash of movement. Jane. She was running back. I tried to scream for her to stop, to leave, to get the hell out of here. But she didn't. Instead, she grabbed me. She ripped me away from the thing. Its claws sliced into my leg as I tore free. And then we were running, sprinting, crashing toward the truck. The creatures shrieked, not a sound of anger, a sound of hunger. The ground quivered beneath us, a living, rotting thing. Jane shoved me into the passenger seat. I barely registered her sliding behind the wheel. The truck roared to life. Something slammed into the back of the truck as we peeled away. I heard it howl, its voice scraping against my brain like rusted metal. And then we were gone. We didn't stop driving. Not until the smell was gone. Not until the world felt real again. Jane didn't say anything for a long time. Then finally she whispered, "It's never over, is it?" I looked at my hands, at the dark, oily stain that had soaked into my skin, and I knew. The smell wasn't just how it found you. It was how it made sure you could never leave. I don't know how long I have before it finds me again. I can still smell it. Faint, just at the edge of my senses, like it's inside me now, like it's just waiting for me to be alone. If you ever smell it, that sickly, rotting stench that sticks to your skin, that fills your lungs like a funeral shroud, don't stop, don't breathe, and for the love of God, run.